Good evening, our Patriot family, and welcome to a special edition of the Fight for Patriotism, where we will be discussing the possibilities of what if John and Robert Kennedy lived, and what our country would look like if they did. I'm your producer, host, and brother ▲ and with me is your brother Angry Conservative. I'll say the Bible verse of the day, play my introduction, and then I'll check on how our brother is doing. The Bible verse of Wednesday, August 10th, 2022 is, "So that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. One part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it." 1 Corinthians 12:25-27 NIV.
We need you now. We need you now. One day, one day, one day, I hope you see the truth. This puppet show stays on because of you. We've been dancing with the devil way too long. I know it's fun, but get ready to pay your dues. Oh God, come back home. This crazy world is filled with liars and abusers. We need you now before we're too far gone. I hope one day they finally see the truth. God, we need you now.
How are you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing well, Zach. How are you doing? And Zach, I got a quick question for you and for everyone down in that chat, down in the chat. What would it be like if JFK and RFK were still alive? What do you think it would be like right now in the United States of America?
I'm doing great, thank you for asking. And well, Angry, to answer your question, I feel like if John and Robert Kennedy weren't assassinated, I believe that we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in today. I believe they were on a mission to stop the cabal and everything to make America a beautiful country. They weren't about the slimy establishment that the government wanted. They wanted to have us prosper, in my humble opinion.
Brother, I totally agree with you. But the thing about it, yes, we are going down this road tonight. And if anyone hasn't realized, the question that I was speaking of the last couple of weeks on Wednesday nights was this question, because I knew all about all the videos Mr. Zach had, because he's been showing me what he was going to do with this. But this is an important question. We can think about what it was like, but we really will never know because of what's happened. So, and Mayhem, I totally agree with you on that one. I totally agree with you. And that's why the last couple of weeks, even though I had known it's coming, that's why I haven't asked it. As you can tell, the video from yesterday, that me and Zach did yesterday. That little short one. We knew, me and him talked about doing that from the very first week because we were like, we wanted to give you a hint to think about your answer for tonight. So that's why we're doing it the way we're doing this. And maybe it won't be too, I don't know how long this is going to go, but the last couple of weeks, it's been 2.5 hours. And hello, Tom, and hello, Mayhem, and everybody else down in the chat.
It will probably be around 90 minutes tonight.
All right. Zach, let's get started with the first. We're done. Hello, Canadian Patriot. Is the first one the JFK or RFK? Hey, Cindy. And yes, I'm saying RFK for a reason.
JFK.
All right, let's see what it would be like if President Kennedy was still alive today. That's an interesting. That's gonna be fun to watch. Let's get at it, Zach.
He is one of the most famous presidents in United States history. He was young and charismatic, and while JFK was quite a special figure in American politics, he was far more famous in death. The story of this man struck down so sudden in a public setting both horrified and captivated the world. Lots of people now ask the question, one that I'll try to answer as well. What if JFK was never assassinated? What if he continued to be president throughout most of the 1960s? What would be the effects on American society and maybe even the world? Looking back on the events of his presidency and historical facts, I'll try to predict how this alternate timeline may look if JFK indeed survived. When people imagine a world where JFK lived, it's basically a world where Lyndon Johnson was not president. When Kennedy was killed, LBJ was put into the presidency. While both shared similar domestic views, their qualities as politicians would create much different results for the US. So in this scenario, the most accurate thing to do is ask what Kennedy could have done differently that Johnson wouldn't have, while also looking at the significance Johnson played to shape America today. The 1960s was dominated with racial violence and the rapid growth of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. had been advocating for an end to segregation and other unfair practices since the 1950s. JFK sympathized with the struggle of the black population, even calling the wife of MLK after his arrest and then pressuring for his release. However, Kennedy was never truly vocal about it until the last few months of his presidency. Why was this? He was worried about losing the support of white Southern Democrats, focused on the upcoming 1964 election. When he did eventually speak up for civil rights, he argued the debate as a moral one, stressing that if America truly was free, we would treat every American as equal. Public segregation was still in effect across the United States, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education banned it in public schools. Whites from both the North and South didn't want to integrate. His legislation, the Civil Rights Act, was not only to ban segregation in public, but to use the federal government to protect the rights of all races, genders, etc. However, he never got to see his bill pass, as he was killed while it was in committee. It wasn't until LBJ's presidency the following year where the bill was finally passed. So in this alternate timeline where JFK never dies, what happens? The civil rights movement might have actually been set back. Why is this? JFK's relationship with Congress was rough to begin with. He beat out Nixon by the slimmest of margins in the election. He hardly related to the aging Congress, and by his death, his Civil Rights Act was in limbo in the Rules Committee, where it was basically held hostage, planned to never move forward. However, Kennedy's death changed all that. It removed a Northern Democrat from the office and replaced him with a Southern Democrat, LBJ. This fundamental shift, ironically, saved Kennedy's bill. Johnson carried the torch left by Kennedy, and he was much more vocal about minority rights than even JFK was. He didn't care about stepping on toes to twist. Just 5 days after JFK's death, LBJ rallied for the passing of the Civil Rights Act, saying that by not doing so would disrespect Kennedy's memory. LBJ had one thing Kennedy didn't: influence. He had history inside Congress and knew how it worked. He navigated around the tricks they would use. He used his famous Johnson treatment, standing over to convince or straight up intimidate to get those on his side, even telling one opponent of the bill, "If you get in the way, I'm going to run you down." And even after all the political games, navigations, and techniques by the Johnson administration, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 barely passed after 83 days of filibuster. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would not have the political influence or power to push such a bill through. It took all the skill of a well-connected Southern Democrat to pass it. A disliked Northerner wouldn't have had a chance. The act would have either taken much longer, died while in committee, or be considerably weaker than in our timeline. Because of this, MLK and other civil rights leaders would still rally for reform against segregation. Without the federal power to force the states to stop Jim Crow laws, protests and racial violence would be more drawn out. We would see more police crackdown, firebombings, assassinations, basically just a bloodier path for ending segregation that would have been passed quicker in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, without the Civil Rights Act, bills like the Voting Rights Act and Title IX would arrive later than in our timeline. They would still occur. However, if Kennedy was still alive, the civil rights movement would have taken a step back simply because JFK didn't have the influence Johnson had. Speaking of Johnson's influence in Congress, LBJ's presidency brought on a lot of immense change to the United States. He used the same tactics for his new legislation reforms, declaring a war on poverty and creating programs for his great society, very similar to FDR with the New Deal. Johnson's administration directly led to Medicaid, Medicare, PBS, expanded Social Security, created the National Endowment of the Arts, and numerous conservation and housing projects. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would call for a war on poverty as well. He planned to do the same efforts as Johnson once he was reelected. Johnson's policies were actually just continued plans of JFK's. However, Kennedy never would have expanded his reforms as drastically as LBJ had. Kennedy would have easily defeated the Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. This is without a doubt. Goldwater's Cold War attitude scared many in the US, and in our timeline, it led Johnson to win in one of the most lopsided victories in United States history. Kennedy would have won as well, and stayed president until 1968. You can't talk about JFK without how he would have handled Vietnam. Would the war have even happened? Or would he have fell into the same trap Johnson did and sent American troops into Southeast Asia? Well, let's look at Kennedy's mindset during the presidency. Kennedy never wanted to get into Vietnam. He never wanted to involve American troops in a direct war against the North. But JFK wasn't a pushover either. He was a hardline anti-communist, but a realist in return. He knew not every situation resulted in an American victory, but would go through the best efforts to prevent communist expansion in the process. Not be understated how much Kennedy distrusted his military advisors. He often went against their opinions, aiming for more peaceful routes. This can be seen in Laos and Cuba, where he didn't escalate the situation to war. Each time, JFK did his own thing. In this alternate timeline, since John F. Kennedy lives to face the greater challenge of Vietnam, the U.S. never gets itself completely involved in the war. JFK distrusted his generals and their over-optimism in conflict. He saw the dangers such a political quagmire would bring. Kennedy tried his hardest to downplay the situation in Vietnam. He knew that the public would quickly call for a war if the communists got the upper hand. He was right. Today we forget how fast Americans rallied for war in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the document that started American involvement, passed overwhelmingly in Congress. Good thing we don't have that rash thinking anymore. It just wasn't in Kennedy's personality as a leader to escalate the situation so far that Lyndon Johnson did. Of course, he was a believer in the domino theory and saw the threat North Vietnam posed, but if the war still came, it would have been different. The massive bombing runs, search and destroy, body counts, that was Johnson's solution, not Kennedy's. Even with full American effort to deter North Vietnam, the South would have fell anyway. JFK would have been the president that lost South Vietnam. I imagine on this alternate timeline, it would be a hot debate today whether America should have gotten involved. From a simple human cost, over 60,000 American soldiers and countless Vietnamese don't die in the fighting. Of course, conservative Vietnamese still die, but not at the level as in our timeline. Without the Vietnam War, the relationship between U.S. citizens and the government is different. The images that they saw every night were not supporting the story of a successful war the Johnson administration boasted. hippie movement, or more accurately, counterculture of the 1960s, would still have existed. Counterculture was created by many different factors, from civil rights, feminism, to simple rebellion against the Leave It to Beaver family of the 1950s. Sorry, Nixon, hippies still would have existed. However, the anti-war movement against Vietnam expanded counterculture to college kids and young people, those personally affected by the draft. Without the war, this counterculture would have taken much longer to appear in American society. In this alternate timeline, it's likely Johnson and Nixon would both run for the presidency. However, it's difficult to predict who would win. Much of the scenario becomes extremely complex, too much for the size of this video. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. Why was Kennedy so significant? He only served around 2 years in office. How did he leave such a lasting impact? I believe it was because Kennedy embodied the hopeful future of America. Resilient, clever, his dream was America's dream, but his sudden tragic end put an end to that and brought on the reality. Following JFK's death, there was certainly a change. The race riots, culture shift, Americans bogged down overseas. The 60s and 70s were tough decades for the United States. And so looking back, it's not difficult to see JFK as that last glimmering hope of what could have been. There certainly was lots of progress after his death, but there was also certainly lots of distrust, tension, and rebellion as well. Maybe things would have been different had JFK lived. We'll never truly know. This is just one scenario out of the countless possibilities. Like on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.
Hey guys, I'm Chris, and here is my list of the top 10 deadliest assassins. Now, for the record, I'm talking about actual contract killers whose profession is killing discreetly. It's as much about the style and success of the killing as it is how many people they actually kill.
That would have been interesting, Zach. If LBJ was never president, I think we wouldn't have the corruption right now in DC. That's just my belief. And Zach, do you want me to say something that we were talking about in private? All the people that are on the main channel, this is not for the people on number 2. This is just the main channel, the Fight for Patriotism main channel. Please, a link will be given to you. Please go over to the second to the Fight for Patriotism number 2, because we are shutting down the main channel. We started on that channel because we're trying to get more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the second one, please do so when you get over there. And here is the link for the second channel for the actual stream. Please, everyone click on that link, go over to the backup channel. That way we can have everyone over there. We are trying to get more people to subscribe to the backup channel because Zach is going to be on the backup channel more than what he is on the main channel until the strikes go away. So please. Thank you everybody for coming over. We appreciate this. That we're trying to get Zach more subscribers on this backup channel. I'm trying to help my buddy out. He's a good guy and everything. All right. And now, if you would please hit that like. When you come over to this one, please hit that like button for our brother, because we do need them likes up. All right. But I will say this for Zach. Thank you for subscribing to the backup channel, because most people don't know that the backup channel is actually here. So we're trying to get him more people over here, trying to get him as many as what's on the main channel. Hey, Sharon Mercer.
Thank you, guys, and I'll be shut.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you,
Zach.
guys, and I'll be shutting down number one.
All right. But thank you, everybody, for coming and coming over to the backup channel. I'm trying to help my brother out, because, man, if you can actually see the back of the backstage, the private chat, me and him was talking about trying to get everyone over here. So, Zach, what do you think? Do you think, Robert, if JF, would we have been better off without LBJ being president? I agree with that. What does everyone in the chat think? Do you think with what the guy went through, do you think that was actually a good determination of what would actually happen if JFK was not assassinated and he served 8 years as president of the United States? We want your feedback. We want you guys to actually tell us what you think about what we just shared, because this is as much about us as it is just as much about you as it is us. Oh, Z-Man's got taken down. Dang. And Tom, you're right, bud. You're right. And Virginia, thank you for joining Zach's new channel. We're gonna get
president, and I think it had not led to Nixon.
I got a question. And since you brought up Nixon, if JFK won in 64 and Nixon never got into the White House, because Nixon got into the White House in 60, was elected president in 64. Watergate would have never happened, would it? How history could have been a lot different. Dang. And Zach, give Lisa has the link for the Robert's backup channel if you want to. Oh. Hi, a fool will believe anything. I'm going to say this now. I can understand at the age of 8 years old, but let me ask you this. What do you think of LBJ today after all the stuff that's come out about the man? What do you think of the man today? I thought Nixon was 60. Thank you, Tom. Rhyme of the ancients, that's very true. And that is very true. LBJ. So you want the destruction of the nuclear family. That was LBJ with the welfare state. Him saying that he will have black people vote. I know he didn't actually say it in public, but he made a statement to his personal people that he will have the black people voting for the Democrats for 200 years. He would still use the N-word after the civil rights movement. There's a lot of things that's come out of the corruption with Vietnam. There is a lot of stuff that came out about LBJ after the fact. That's, Virginia, very true. But, so do we have another video from alternative history there, Mr. Zach, about JFK? What if this one? I honestly think if Robert Kennedy actually lived, very true. But this is going to be an interesting one. Zach, do you think he would? Do you think he would have been as good of a president as JFK was in his first couple of years? Now, there's a question for you, for everyone. Do you think Robert Kennedy would have been as good of a president as his brother was in the first couple of years? You guys let me know.
I think Robert would have been because he knew the law.
Very true. Very true. Robert did know the law. Because him being that good of a lawyer to be Attorney General of the United States says something about the man. But I'm gonna plug myself here for a minute. I did a stream yesterday on the man that started the federal income tax, which needs to go away, in my opinion. I did one on freaking William Howard Taft. That's right. And Book Girl, you're right. He would have known the law. But this is why I love these discussions. Hey, Tats. But this is why I love doing stories like this. Zach, what do you think? Do you think Robert would have used his practice of the law to actually benefit the American people? And this is why it's so important to have these discussions. What if? Because the Kennedy family, for crying out loud, the Kennedy family is And that, yeah, it would have been a very interesting. All right, Zach, you ready to start up? What if Robert F. Kennedy had lived?
One of the great privileges working at History Hit and making films together with our team at Timeline is the access we get to extraordinary historical locations. Like this one, Stonehenge. I'm right in the middle of the stone circle now. It is an absolutely extraordinary place to visit. If you want to watch the documentary like the one we're producing here, go to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix for history. And if you use the code Timeline when you check out, you'll get a special introductory offer. See you there.
January the 20th, 1969. The 37th President of the United States was about to take the oath of office. Few had thought he stood a chance of victory. His party had been against him. The sitting president hated him. But against the odds, Robert Francis Kennedy had triumphed.
Bobby shows toughness, he shows guts, he shows persistence.
You see him show some of the courage and some of the compassion for people, his desire to do what was right.
He was going up against probably a much more qualified candidate, and it looked like he was a real long shot.
His campaign was about reconciliation, cooperation, bringing everybody together.
It was a presidency to heal division and mend injustice. It was a presidency to chart the course of American history for decades to come. It was a presidency that was not to be.
For the last 50 years, America has been looking for what Bobby Kennedy could have given us.
He's someone who people could identify with because they felt like they've seen him endure horrendous tragedy, and to come out the other side with a positive and hopeful vision.
Had he lived, I think he would have been one of our great presidents.
It is the story of a Cold War warrior who became an advocate for peace, of a son of privilege who became a champion of the downtrodden. It is a story of tragedy and triumph, of high ideals and dirty tricks. It is the story of America's lost president. Cape Cod, on America's Atlantic coast. Like many wealthy families, it was here that the Kennedys passed their summers. In 1930, Bobby Kennedy was 4 years old, the seventh of 9 children. He was a small and awkward boy. His siblings mocked his buck teeth, his stammer, his inability to swim. One day, while they were out sailing, Bobby's brothers made one joke too many. Bobby decided to show them just how well he could swim. He jumped off the boat and almost drowned. Bobby always had that quiet, stubborn tenacity, that gut instinct for the sudden gesture. It was an inner resolve forged by insecurity.
Bobby was what his dad described as the runt of the litter.
He was shyer, he was not as sociable or naturally gregarious as his older brothers and his older sisters.
Bobby Kennedy was an introverted child. He really, in a way, identified with Rose, his mother, more.
Bobby was a devout Catholic, much like his mother. And by embracing that part of his mother, he had a different relationship with her than the other ones did.
His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, had high expectations of all his children, especially the boys.
Joseph P. Kennedy was one of the wealthiest men in America at the time. It was Cape Cod for summers, it was Palm Beach for winters.
He had made a fortune in the stock market. He was about to expand into Hollywood movies, into other financial pursuits, and his fortune would continue to grow.
He knew everybody in Boston. He was a big mover and shaker, kind of like a godfather.
Joe Sr. set the pattern, and the way things were, that you fell in line and did what was expected of you.
Kennedy was a powerful figure in the Democratic Party. He was determined that one of his sons would become president of the United States. It was his eldest child, Joseph Jr., who carried those hopes at first. But in August 1944, he was killed while on a dangerous mission in wartime Europe. He was just 29.
This was the golden child, Joe Jr., the devastation to Joe Kennedy and through Joe to all of the 8 remaining kids was extraordinary.
Of course, it broke the whole family to pieces, but it really shattered Bobby. He didn't know what to do.
I mean, this was his older brother, someone he idolized. He was 10 years older than Bobby. So he's a real hero to Bobby, and he took the news very, very hard.
He also understood that he now has to play a new role in this family that he had not thought he was going to have to play.
Joseph Kennedy shifted his ambitions to his second son, Jack. In 1946, he won his first election, becoming congressman for the 11th District of Massachusetts. That same year, Bobby began his studies at Harvard.
He wasn't a stellar student. I mean, the teacher said he kind of didn't make an impression.
He was sort of a C student, maybe even a D student. Bobby was a little bit outshone academically by his older brothers, particularly.
However, Bobby did excel his brothers in one respect. He was the first of them to marry.
▴ᖿᖿᑍ was the roommate of Bobby's younger sister, Jean, in college.
Bobby was, in those years, shy and had to have the real personality pulled out of him, and there was nobody better in the world to do that than the extraordinary, outgoing, gregarious, funny, charming Ethel.
Thanks to a word from his father, in 1951, the newly married Bobby began work as a lawyer at the Department of Justice. But within months, he was called away. His brother Jack was running for Senate. His father wanted the 26-year-old Bobby to run the campaign.
He took the role out of a family obligation. And that was something that Bobby often did.
It was Bobby who was there steering the campaign. It was Bobby doing all the dirty work behind the scenes where Jack could look like the good guy up front. He was his consigliere.
Bobby Kennedy understood very clearly what his job was to be. His job was to help the Crown Prince, Jack.
The election took place on the same day as the presidential contest. That saw Republican Dwight Eisenhower demolish his opponent in a landslide. But the Kennedy brothers bucked the trend. John F. Kennedy was elected senator.
Good. Well, I'm guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Robin? I am, Jack. Okay.
Weeks later, Bobby began a new job of his own. He joined the office of another senator, an old family friend and fellow Catholic. It was not a Democrat, however, but a Republican, and one of the most notorious men in the country.
Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that when he called up and said, "My son needs a job," Joe McCarthy was going to give him a job.
He's a staunch anti-communist. He's convinced that there are, subversive communist types hiding out in the government at all levels, and he's going to root them out.
You had these hearings on TV where people would come on and Joe McCarthy would ask people if they were communists, accuse them of all kinds of stuff, and Bobby would be at the table as the lawyer, as the counsel, and he was there.
Bobby Kennedy's role with Joe McCarthy was rooted in his fierce morality, was rooted in the idea that there were communists and somebody needed to do something about it.
Bobby Kennedy believed in what Joe McCarthy was doing. He believed, like Joe McCarthy, that there was no threat to the world that was greater than the communist threat.
Bobby soon became disillusioned, however. His advancement was blocked by other staff. He clashed with them repeatedly. He left the senator's office after less than a year. Bobby was nearing 30 and desperate to make a name for himself. That opportunity finally arrived in 1957, when he became chief counsel to the Senate Labor Rackets Committee.
Bobby was on that committee to go after the ruthless elements in it, the labor unions, which were all powerful in those days.
He went after especially the most powerful union leader in America at the time, the head of the biggest union called the Teamsters, which represented all the truckers, and this was a guy named Jimmy Hoffa.
This experience really suits Bobby because he feels like he's
Quick
going
question
after
for everybody, and Zach, you don't have to stop it.
he's a very right
Did
and wrong
Robert
person.
Kennedy know who killed Jimmy Hoffa?
Committee was
Quick question for everybody. Did Robert Kennedy know who killed Jimmy Hoffa? That's an interesting question. Hey, Garrett. That's why when they brought the name Jimmy Hoffa up, where'd you go in 75? Oh, oh, for crying out. Yeah. I'm gonna say this now. I love you guys, but some of you need some professional help, me included. And I know you ain't wrong. I'm not a commie. I'm not a commie. So does AC stand for angry communist? No, you didn't ruin my Cindy. You didn't ruin my fun. I know when Jimmy Hoffa went missing. I just thought I would ask the question because I'm trying to get people to laugh a little bit with this, and I got Zach to laugh, so it's all good.
No, Cindy, I freaking love you.
Oh, for crying out! So like communist. Zach, I don't do this very often, but I have a sound for the ones that think I'm a communist. Fuck you. Now it's gonna be angry communist, angry contortionist. I'm all over the place. Oh, for crying out loud. Robert, I know he went missing in 75, but I'm trying to get people to laugh. Yes, we're touching on something a little serious here, but it's good to laugh a little bit with everything going on. But all right, Zach, let's get back to the show.
Bobby Kennedy's desire to find justice, to expose corrupt people, to expose the problems of American society, because that's what he believed he was always fighting for.
Bobby Kennedy saw what was going on with Jimmy Hoffa and union corruption as almost as big a threat to America as the communists.
Hoffa would continue to elude justice, but Bobby's efforts were not unnoticed. No longer the runt of the Kennedy clan, there was even talk of a political career of his own. But family loyalty intervened once again. In 1960, his older brother launched a bid to become president. Bobby would be there to help. This was the year the Kennedy family had been waiting for. It would bring a presidential election in the November. It had long been earmarked as JFK's moment. First, though, he had to win the nomination.
Bobby Kennedy was the person who controlled that election. He had been so successful in the Senate election that he had taken the reins of this election, and he was fiercely committed to this.
You didn't necessarily win the presidential nomination through primaries. They were important more as kind of signals of who had popular support.
He did it by taking on the opposition, taking on the difficult issues of whether a Catholic in the White House would be an instrument of the Pope. Bobby took on all those issues.
He runs a pretty innovative campaign. He wants to tap the excitement and the sort of novelty and sense of freshness about Jack's campaign. It's sort of a glimpse of what more modern campaigns will become.
Early victory in Protestant West Virginia seemed to prove the Kennedy appeal could break down the barriers of anti-Catholicism. In primary after primary, Kennedy victory followed Kennedy victory. But the nomination was not secure yet. The decision would be made at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. There, the Kennedy's last possible rival made his move.
Lyndon Baines Johnson is arguably one of the most incredible politicians that ever lived in the United States of America, an absolute master of politics.
He's the Senate Majority Leader. He's one of the most powerful men in Washington. And he decides to run a very different kind of campaign.
Johnson had entered the race late. He thought, based on his name and his connections within politics, he could still maybe get the nomination.
He thinks that he will be able to control and win support of more delegates at the Democratic Convention. He doesn't need to enter the primaries and win delegates that way.
Bobby had disliked Lyndon Johnson from their first meeting, and the feeling was mutual.
Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did not get along.
Lyndon Johnson was a politician who can get bills passed into law because he understood how the system worked. Bobby Kennedy was the moralist. He didn't like the politicians that did the backroom deals.
He started off as a school teacher. He worked his way up, and the Kennedys were rich guys, and they got everything they wanted. So there was this enmity that began.
Lyndon Johnson tried to get out a story that John F. Kennedy was actually very sick. Bobby Kennedy found out, and he was furious with Johnson.
Bobby Kennedy got a doctor to come out and say, no, my brother doesn't have life-threatening Addison's disease. Well, in fact, Jack Kennedy had a really serious version of Addison's disease.
So Bobby Kennedy essentially flat out lies, but in defense of his brother, and Johnson actually ends up backing down.
Made Bobby Kennedy hate Lyndon Johnson for the rest of his life.
Johnson's dirty tricks failed.
And I can assure all of you here who have reposed this confidence in me, that I will be worthy of your trust. We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
Now JFK had to choose a running mate. One man's connections and know-how made him the obvious choice. Johnson would share the Kennedy ticket, but neither he nor Bobby would forget their dispute. Jack went on to face sitting Vice President Richard Nixon in the general election. Once again, Bobby ran his brother's campaign. It would be the narrowest of triumphs. But at last, the Kennedys were on their way to the White House.
After Jack is elected, Joe Kennedy, his father, turns around and says, okay, what about Bobby?
Bobby didn't want to be involved in the cabinet. He wanted to go do something by himself. So Bobby said to his brother, what are we going to do about my situation? And he said, look, I need somebody next to me who I can count on. So Bobby accepted right then and there.
His official title in the new administration was Attorney General, which was an interesting title for a guy who had never practiced a day in a court of law.
He's very inexperienced. He's one of the youngest attorney generals ever named. Is this the right person to be choosing for this role? Should you be putting your kid brother into office?
The 35-year-old Bobby was made head of a bureaucracy with more than 30,000 employees and a $400 million budget. And his power extended far beyond the Justice Department.
If you couldn't get past Bobby, you didn't get to Jack. So He was the gatekeeper. He was his first consul. He was the guy. I mean, he was everything to Jack Kennedy.
He looks to his brother for advice and counsel and expects his brother to do an enormous amount within the cabinet, within government to advance his agenda and protect his political interests.
John Kennedy didn't have a chief of staff. His brother became his chief of staff. Bobby spoke. He was speaking not only for himself, but also his brother.
He was the closest thing that America had ever seen and probably will ever see to a co-president.
Bobby was there through crisis and triumph, and when the world faced the horrors of nuclear Armageddon, he was at his brother's side once again.
There are a lot of conflicting stories about the Cuban Missile Crisis and who was most influential and who was articulating what strategy when.
It's really hard now for people who weren't born then or were too young to really realize how dangerous that was.
Kennedy's confronted with these missiles in Cuba. If he responds, it could mean war. Well, Bobby Kennedy was right in that room, giving him advice.
It was a 13-day crisis, and Bobby would have you believe in the book that he wrote called 13 Days, that he was the great ▴
He is depicted as someone who is reluctant to go with a more aggressive solution, whether an airstrike or an invasion of Cuba.
The truth is, for the first 6 or so days, Bobby Kennedy was one of the biggest hawks. And it was midway through the crisis when his brother Jack made clear that a middle ground of a blockade was the way to save the world from a nuclear Armageddon, that Bobby jumped on board and became Jack's best advocate.
Nuclear confrontation was averted. The crisis passed. Energies in the White House shifted to conflicts closer to home. America remained an unequal, unjust land. But the Kennedy brothers had long been cautious about civil rights. The support of pro-segregation Southern Democrats had been crucial to their victory in 1960, and would be again, they thought, at the next election.
It's not necessarily the top priority, and it's not necessarily something that's keeping Bobby Kennedy up at night.
He started out as clueless on civil rights, having grown up in lily-white worlds.
There's voting rights laws on the books by then, and as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy's Department of Justice is involved in trying to, file suits and prosecute cases to try and get more African Americans enrolled in Southern states. But there isn't really a lot of action on civil rights early on in the Kennedy administration.
It was the violence suffered by the Freedom Riders in 1961 that opened Bobby's eyes. The activists fighting segregation on interstate bus routes were set upon by white mobs in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery. Local police colluded in the attacks.
This is, a rude awakening for Bobby Kennedy in terms of dealing with these Southern governors who will tell him one thing, but then essentially allow violence to be perpetrated on these activists. And so he starts to get much more involved.
I think he identified with them somewhere in himself. He understood something quite profound, and Black people knew that he did.
He ended up being somebody that was the most effective Attorney General.
Cindy, I agree, because Bobby knew how to work around the law, unlike politicians.
What did Miss Cindy say? I didn't even see it. I was doing something. I think there were, I'm not going to say this, Cindy, I think there were a few people that he could trust, but the majority of the people around him, yeah, it was very small. It was probably a half a dozen at the most is what I'm thinking. But yeah, Bobby was probably the only one that he really trusted.
In terms of promoting civil rights.
Bobby really said, look, we got to do this. We got to make this happen. We got to go all in with these people because this country is not going to be anything if we don't go all in with them.
Bobby expanded the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. He demanded that government recruit more black employees. And he convinced his brother, the president, that civil rights was the defining domestic issue of their times.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
But as ever in the White House, one eye was on the politics. The end of 1963 approached, and thoughts turned to the presidential contest due the following year. The Kennedy machine geared up once more. Campaign visits were sketched out, practice runs arranged. Among the first was a trip to Dallas, Texas. The direct line to the White House. It was urgent.
Ethel Kennedy, his wife, picks it up and pulls up the line and says, "It's J. Edgar Hoover on the phone for you." And as soon as Bobby heard that, his stomach began to sink. He knew that Hoover never called with good news.
J. Edgar Hoover said, "The president has been shot and it may be fatal."
He is ashen-faced. He's, shocked. And in that moment, Bobby Kennedy's life changed dramatically and forever.
It created a kind of fatalistic feeling in Bobby. His brother was the golden boy. So if he can get killed, anything can happen now. Anything can happen.
Bobby became America's mourner-in-chief. Every time a picture was taken, he was there delivering the most moving eulogy. Bobby pulled it together and he helped America pull it together. Just when the rest of the family was starting to come out of their sense of grief, just when the country was coming out of its sense of mourning, Bobby crashed and burned.
Out of the public eye, Bobby collapsed into a deep depression. Jack had been his work and his family life. Bobby had nowhere to hide from his grief.
He questions his faith. He can't understand how this happened. How could God let something like this happen?
He would drive around in the middle of winter in a convertible with the top down, going nowhere. He would go to work at the Justice Department and would look so out of it that people were afraid to talk to him. And it lasted until the following fall, nearly a full 9 or 10 months, and it was devastating for him.
There was one person who came close to understanding Bobby's pain, his sister-in-law, the newly widowed Jackie.
He went to help his sister-in-law, who was in shock and depression, of course, because she was there when it happened. He died on her lap.
She recommends certain books to RFK, who had never been the most amazing student, had never been the most intellectually curious. But in this moment, when his faith is shaken, his fundamental beliefs are shaken, he's looking for something.
He started to question certain things. And it was Jackie Kennedy who gave him Edith Hamilton's The Greek Way. His whole philosophy as he got older, he believed, was to tame the savageness of man, make gentle the world we live in. And that came directly from the Greeks.
Robert Kennedy goes on an intellectual and spiritual journey. What comes out of that is actually a new sense of himself as an individual, his own sense of purpose, and a sense that he still wants to contribute to the world.
Bobby had to figure out at that point what he was going to do for the rest of his life. Was he going to go off and be a monk or teach at a college or travel the world with his father's money and his burgeoning family that would become 11 kids? Or was he going to somehow re-enter the public arena?
After Jack's death, Lyndon B. Johnson had been sworn in immediately as his successor. Many hoped it would be Bobby to fill the now vacant vice presidency, but the two men hated each other.
They went through a long dance as to who was going to be LBJ's vice president. Bobby said that he wanted it. LBJ said that he was serious.
I just thought of an idea. I think John, Robert, and Martin Luther King were assassinated in the same time because they wanted unity and not be divided.
Now that's an interesting. President Kennedy was assassinated in 1962. Martin Luther King Jr. died in, what was it, 1965? And Robert Kennedy was 60. All right. All right.
63 John, and both Robert and Martin 68.
Tom just put that in the chat. All right. Now that is an interesting. That's an interesting. Yeah, Booker, I was thinking about Malcolm X. Because he died in between President Kennedy and that. Holy Zach! That's a heck of. That is a heck of a statement. That is a heck of a. Even with Malcolm X, he wanted to bring people together. The two Kennedy brothers wanted to bring people together. Martin Luther King Jr., his famous speech is trying to bring people together. But Joe Kerr, I will say this now. Malcolm X even said stuff about Republicans. So Malcolm X didn't want either political party. So that Malcolm X was on the right path when he said that Democrats will act like your friend to the black people. But yeah. Those four deaths, and I'm not taking away from any other deaths. The only one that might be more significant, in my opinion, other than them four, would be Abraham Lincoln. That assassination would probably be more a higher degree than the four of these, but I'm not taking anything away from these four. To have them four in a 5-year period says something. 4 deaths from 1963 until 1968. Whoa. And I'm going to ask this, and Zach, I'm going to try to stay away from the political. The raid. Were they trying to do something to 45? Just think about that. Let's get back to this. We don't have to talk about what happened Monday, but I want people to think about that. Were they trying to do this thing? Let's keep on with Robert Kennedy.
We're going to consider him. These two guys hated one another enough that there was never a question. The last guy in the world that Johnson would have wanted at his side in the White House was Bobby Kennedy.
And he said basically, if this guy is my vice president, people will think I can't do this by myself. I'm not going to win the next, the election by myself because I'm with the Kennedy.
Despite the clamor for another Johnson-Kennedy partnership, the president chose Hubert Humphrey instead. Bobby remained as Attorney General, but his vast influence over government was gone.
He helps to push through the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which Lyndon Johnson also pushes for as a kind of legacy to President Kennedy.
He and his enemy, Lyndon Johnson, collaborated on getting that bill passed. Johnson couldn't have done it without Bobby, and Bobby couldn't have done it without a Southerner like Johnson backing it.
He stayed there mostly for the Civil Rights Act of '64 and wanted to pass that. And when that passed in July, he started thinking about the next step.
Bobby resigned as Attorney General in September 1964, shortly after announcing his bid for the Senate seat of New York. Finally, he was launching a political career of his own.
Ultimately, he decides that he wants to continue in public service, but he wants to do so in a new way, and he needs to do it on his own steam.
He struggled a little bit. He understood how to be the guy behind the guy. He didn't understand how to be the candidate. He talked a lot about his brother. He used some of the same gestures as his brother. And in a lot of ways, I think he saw that campaign as a way to honor his brother's legacy. And some of his aides were telling him, you have to speak your own mind.
It wasn't until the middle of that campaign, when it looked like he could be the first Kennedy ever to lose an election, that Bobby started pulling it together.
On November the 3rd, 1964, Lyndon Johnson was re-elected president in a landslide. That same day, Bobby Kennedy won his race in New York.
He has a different kind of stature from your average, incoming junior senator who's able to shine a spotlight on particular issues that he cares about. And he does that immediately.
He believed that poverty was one of the biggest problems that the United States had been experiencing. So he started to look at ways to affect that.
Bobby Kennedy set up a model program, a model anti-poverty program in a place called Bedford-Stuyvesant, the biggest ghetto in America, in Brooklyn, New York, just outside of Manhattan. That became the model for Lyndon Johnson's famous war on poverty. No senator was more effective in promoting an end to poverty and an end to racial injustice than Bobby Kennedy.
But America was a divided nation. The pace of change, too slow for some, frightened others. And all the while, the war in Vietnam dragged on and on. The US had been involved in the conflict since the time of Eisenhower. The Kennedy administration, with Bobby's support, had broadened that military aid. But it was under Johnson that the war became an American nightmare.
He didn't want to look like the guy who took over for Jack Kennedy and lost America's first war.
Johnson commits combat troops. He starts bombing campaigns so that the Vietnam conflict is growing and becoming a much bigger war and a much bigger part of the public conversation.
Bobby had been a hawk in the early 60s during his brother's administration, but the situation in Vietnam had changed in the years since, and so had Bobby.
Bobby Kennedy is concerned about the escalation of the Vietnam War, and at first he tries to keep that concern relatively quiet. He's worried about how it will be perceived. He's worried about implications for the Democratic Party at the same time that he's incredibly worried about what the president is doing.
Lyndon Johnson wasn't about to listen to Bobby Kennedy on Vietnam or anything important.
In 1967, Bobby traveled to Europe. There, he held talks with foreign leaders and diplomats who backed peace in Vietnam. But the discussions were leaked to a newspaper. Johnson was furious.
Johnson sees this as an attempt to undermine him, and he, personally and publicly condemns Bobby Kennedy, who thinks he's kind of conducting, backdoor diplomacy and challenging his position as president.
Bobby Kennedy decided that he was going to publicly take a stand against the Vietnam War and against the bombing campaign that Lyndon Johnson had been waging against North Vietnam. So in March of '67, he gave a speech on the Senate floor that admonished the administration and said that this was not the right way to go in Vietnam.
He was the first one to matter to get up on the floor of the Senate and say, mea culpa, we got it wrong. We made a mistake, but we've got to correct that mistake. We've got to get out of Vietnam. So he was the most effective anti-war politician and figure of any kind in America in the mid-60s.
Johnson had assured the American people that victory was in sight. But in January 1968, North Vietnam launched a new offensive. A wave of surprise attacks targeted cities and military installations across the country. America's enemy was far from beaten.
The American people who were told by Lyndon Johnson that the war was almost over and there was a light at the end of the tunnel had seen the battles and believed that the war had a long way to go. And they felt deceived somewhat by Lyndon Johnson.
It's a real unnerving moment for the American public, and it's an important turning point in terms of larger public opinion about the war.
The Tet Offensive could not have come at a worse time for Johnson. 1968 was a general election year. He was entitled to seek another term in office, but by now he was deeply unpopular. There was talk in the Democratic Party of a challenge against him.
Lyndon Johnson had won one of the most convincing victories ever in 1964, and yet by 1968, the Vietnam War was unpopular enough that in the first contested primary in the state of New Hampshire, a young, know-nothing senator from Minnesota named Gene McCarthy was running against him.
It's unusual to challenge the sitting president of your own party. As an incumbent president, you certainly would expect to get your own party nomination again without too much trouble.
And Gene McCarthy, when you added up the Democratic votes and the Republican write-in votes, actually beat the sitting president in this New Hampshire primary.
And honestly, LBJ smells fishy that he was connected to all 4 assassinations. He didn't give a crap about America's values.
Zach, I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna be as nice as I can, because me and you've had this discussion. I am gonna try to be as nice as I can. The political establishment, and I'm not just talking one party here. I'm talking about the entire lot of them. I'm talking about all of them. Like you say, it's not about Democrat and it's not about Republican. They're all corrupt. That's my opinion. But he is the one that showed these corrupt cronies that are in D.C. right now how to actually get stuff done. He's the one that started with a lot of the corruption. Yes, there was corruption back before this, but it started at this point to get to where it's at today. I'm just saying, because in my honest opinion, I honestly think LBJ was one of those communists that Manning Johnson talks about in his book. Tom, I would not be surprised if you did. I wouldn't be surprised if you did have one of those. I don't know if you've actually seen his comment, Zach, but it's a pretty good one.
See, that's why I'm covering this time period, because I believe this was the start of the downfall.
Very well could be. It very well could be, because it's people don't. Devil Dog, I wouldn't be surprised if you did or if you didn't. And I don't even see him in the chat. Is he over on the main channel, Zach, or something? Because I don't see Devil Dog in the chat. Oh. Oh, never mind. I see him now. Miss Cola?
The president was even weaker than people thought. The Democratic nomination and the White House itself were up for grabs. Bobby's thoughts turned to a gift his brother had given him years before. When Jack first won the nomination, he'd given his trusted campaign manager a cigarette case. Inscribed on it were the words, "When I'm through, how about you?" On March the 16th, 1968, Robert Francis Kennedy launched his bid to become president.
I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policy.
Bobby was a seasoned campaigner, but his entry into the contest was anything but graceful.
Exactly 4 days after Gene McCarthy showed how vulnerable Lyndon Johnson was by beating him in New Hampshire, Bobby Kennedy jumps into the race and says, "Me too, I'm running too."
Is it political opportunism? Is he jumping in because, Eugene McCarthy's shown that an anti-war candidate can win?
The truth is that a full 9 days before the New Hampshire vote, Bobby Kennedy had told a bunch of reporters that he trusted and everybody who was close to him, "I'm going to run."
He decided to delay it, actually so that he wouldn't deny McCarthy whatever result he was going to get.
It was ham-handed, but it was trying to do a favor rather than undermine Gene McCarthy.
Bobby announced his run on the same spot in the same room where his brother had, almost a decade earlier. But Bobby was now his own man. His platform would embrace causes long dear to him: civil rights, poverty, and of course, the war in Vietnam. Bobby knew it would be difficult. If he had enthusiastic support from some, he was loathed by just as many. And toppling an incumbent president, even one as weak as Lyndon Johnson, would be no simple task. Or so he thought.
I shall not sue, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Nobody could believe he said that. It just, the whole United States erupted. This guy was going, he was gone, he was gone.
Johnson is exhausted. He's been dealing with the escalation of the Vietnam War, the anti-war protests. Lyndon Johnson looks at these developments. Suddenly, Bobby Kennedy's there in the race, doing exactly what Johnson fears, saying, I'm the heir. I'm the person that should be in the Oval Office. And so Johnson takes himself out of the mix.
The race was wide open. Within weeks, Vice President Hubert Humphrey announced his candidacy, in the party establishment's pick, and snapped up hundreds of delegates. But Bobby had been here before. He dusted off the strategy book that had taken his brother to the nomination. He would prove his support in the primaries.
He's got a tough contest with McCarthy, and he's certainly got a tough against Hubert Humphrey. And so Bobby Kennedy has to do incredibly well in the primaries.
It was really a question of whether Bobby Kennedy could convince America that he was a good candidate.
Bobby was kicking off his campaign in Indiana when news broke from Memphis.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
In the Black community in Indianapolis, Bobby Kennedy delivered the most passionate speech and the most effective speech that white politicians ever delivered in Black America.
He said that, we need to love each other. We need to really want to honor Dr. King's vision. We should love.
What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
On a night when there were riots in more than 100 American cities, one of the only cities in America with a sizable black population that didn't riot was Indianapolis, and the reason was Robert Francis Kennedy.
And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Bobby won in Indiana. A week later, he triumphed in Nebraska. His campaign was gaining momentum. Defeat in Oregon, however, left Bobby's chances on a knife edge. June the 4th would see two key primaries, one in South Dakota and the other in California. Losing either would destroy Bobby's hopes. But victory could put him on the path to the presidency.
But the all-important primary was California. It was all-important because it was the biggest state in the country. It had the most diverse population.
California is a huge state with a lot of delegates at play. He needs to win there, and he needs to win convincingly to have a chance.
California seemed forbidding territory. McCarthy had a well-established and well-funded organization there. Bobby's chances looked slim.
He goes into California, he campaigns all over the state, he campaigns in the ghettos, in these urban centers, and he is able to generate a lot of excitement and momentum around his campaign.
What G. McCarthy didn't do that Bobby Kennedy did do was encompass the whole of Vietnam into jobs and racism and all of that.
People talk a lot about Bobby Kennedy's charisma and his appeal. It's different than his brother's. His brother was sort of cool and reserved. Bobby Kennedy, people want to touch him, to grab at him. There are kids running after his car, people shouting out at him. Someone grabs his shoe at one point and sort of takes it home as a prize. Kennedy's campaign is really, on the ground and exciting and emotive.
Bobby triumphed. In South Dakota, he scored a clear win. In California, it was closer, defeating McCarthy by just 4 points. But what mattered was the victory. Suddenly, the nomination seemed within grasp.
My thanks to all of you, and all the Chicago on this win.
Bobby left his supporters celebrating in the ballroom of the Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel. Hurrying to a press conference, he took a shortcut through the kitchens. It was there he crossed paths with 24-year-old Palestinian Sirhan Sirhan.
Sirhan popped out, shot him once in the head, shot him twice in the back, and left him on the floor.
The assailant is caught there in that moment, and Bobby Kennedy is still alive, but the bullet had penetrated his brain. He's taken to hospital and he dies about a day later.
The reason he was gunned down, Sirhan Sirhan said in a note that he had left behind, was because of Bobby Kennedy's support for Israel.
The speculation is that it had something to do with the Six-Day War, which had been the previous year in which Bobby Kennedy had supported Israel.
At the most promising moment in his life, the biggest political victory of his life, he's gunned down.
It was Hubert Humphrey who went on to contest the 1968 election for the Democrats. It would be another close-fought campaign, but this time, Republican Richard Nixon triumphed.
That election in 1968 was arguably one of the most important elections of the last century. There was this extraordinary schism in America over race, and Richard Nixon got a lot of people, a lot of whites who were very angry, to rally around him.
The cities are starting to erupt because of poverty and also just grief and anger. So America wanted a law and order man.
The Nixon years come to be associated with continuing war in Vietnam, the Watergate scandal, the resignation of a president, unprecedented resignation. It's a dark time in American political life. And it's easy to look back at 1968 as this turning point.
But what might have been? What if Bobby had not taken the shortcut through the kitchens? What if a bodyguard had been with him? What if Bobby had lived?
Famous, powerful mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, maybe the most powerful Democratic establishment politician, was going to get behind Bobby, I think would have created a tidal wave of support, and it would have overwhelmed not just Gene McCarthy, who I think was already beaten, would have overwhelmed Hubert Humphrey.
Would he have been able to win in November? Would he have been able to get the American people who were scared, concerned about chaos at home, concerned about America's reputation abroad? Would Bobby Kennedy have been able to find a message that would have mobilized the public more generally?
When we think back to the fact that Hubert Humphrey came within a whisker of beating Richard Nixon, you would have had, I think, on the day after the election in November of 1968, in a president-elect named Robert Francis Kennedy, you would have had a very different America.
We probably get an earlier end to the war in Vietnam, and we get someone that cared about poverty, that cared about civil rights.
Just his transparency alone and his ability to connect with people would have changed how people see the role of government.
He would have not just been a very different, and in my mind, a much better president to heal the wounds in America than Richard Nixon turned out to be. I think he would have been a better president than his brother had been.
His brother's assassination really made him see that life was short and that your job is to do something with it, do something good, or leave something good behind. I think he would have been a great president.
The aims that he articulated, the sense of hope, the sense of optimism, the sense of unity and reconciliation, those are themes that endure.
It is a vision of America that was not to be. It is hope untarnished by compromise or scandal. It is a path forever in sight, but one that can never be reached.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I still have, I make fun of a friend of mine that forgets to unmute himself. I forget to unmute myself, so that's a whole nother. But it's quite interesting that all of this is happening now. It's quite interesting all of this is happening right now because it's, and I think Zach's frozen up. You're back. But Zach, what do you think? Do you think Robert Kennedy seen that? Do you think he's seen it coming for him? Because that is an interest with Robert Kennedy and President Kennedy, I think. But yeah. Oh, excuse me. But, and what does everyone think? Do you think Robert Kennedy seen this coming for him?
I don't think he's seen the assassination coming. He was more focused on healing this country.
Very well. And you're probably right about that because it's But I wonder if he would have won if he, but he would have won. Yeah, the second Kennedy boy probably would have beat his older brother in the number of votes, I would say. That's just my opinion. But yeah, Sharon's right. I would think you'd always know it's a possibility because of, and you would think Robert would be a little more cautious because of his brother situation. But that's just me looking at it. What, about 60 years later, 50 years later? Because you would think you.
Any final words, Angry?
These videos show that sometimes it's good to think about what could have been, because, like we said, four assassinations in a matter of 5 years, and the two most important, in my opinion. I'm not saying JFK wasn't important, but the last two were the two most important assassinations in those 5 years, because you had a person that was running for president that was probably going to become president and things were going to come out, and the other one was a civil rights leader that did not want violence and he wanted to bring people together. I think them are the two most important assassinations in those 5 years, but the other two are just as important as the last two. But Zach will keep giving you the truth about things that have happened. Please, if you can, support this man, because he is doing a hell of a job with everything he does. And Zach, thank you for letting me come up.
Hey family, thank you for coming and letting us express our views on what if John and Robert have lived. I love you all and have a great night.
don't trust the news, the government, or pharma. We just want freedom, that you have that to offer. We don't want the lies, the politics, or the drama. We just want the life that was promised by our fathers. We don't trust the news, the government, or pharma. We just want freedom, that you have that to offer. We don't want the lies, the politics, or the drama. We just want the life that was promised by our fathers. The man on the news says the problem is me. I'm just a small town boy with big American dreams. The world's going crazy and they lying to us. Don't know who to believe, so in God we trust.
Night, everybody.